Hello, and welcome to Understanding the Structure of a Deal, Part 3, Lifts. The third piece of understanding a deal is being able to relate the different lanes and levers of that transaction to your specific business. This video shows you how to apply the various lift scenarios to make sure that you're maximizing your valuation when you're negotiating your lanes and your levers. We're going to talk about how scenario analysis gets really real now. We're going to talk about what scenarios say about your business and then how to relate lifts to deal structure priorities. Okay, we've all seen this graph a few different times, and we're going to focus a lot on the lift part of it, the worst, base, and best case scenarios. A very key concept that we're going to talk about, however, is what's called a weighted average probability analysis of those scenarios. In essence, what we're doing is we're not only putting together the scenarios, but we're starting to say which one is most likely, which one is obviously least likely, and when you put them all together, how do we create an average level of what we would expect our deal to be, which is critical before we go into any negotiating situation. The weighted average of your scenarios is typically the worst, base, and best case multiplied by a percentage that determines the most likely range of your outcome. So for example, if you believe that the cash at closing is essentially 100% likelihood in all three scenarios, that gets weighted with a 1 or a 100%. But your earnout might be weighted much differently in your worst case scenario, close to 0%, and in your best case scenario, it might be 80% likely. When you put all of that together, the key point is this. Rarely is the likely scenario just the midpoint between the worst and the best. It's almost always that there's some weighted average that's going on across each one of your levers that's helping determine what's the right transaction structure for you. Okay. The first thing to recognize is that scenario analysis gets real now because now there's dollars at stake. So as you can see in this particular scenario, you've got your best case scenario. You're all excited about how good this deal is going to go. But you have to remember there's also your base case and your worst case that you have to be thinking about. And you have to make sure that any deal that you structure addresses those types of scenarios as well. A key thing I always like to think about is what are your scenario models saying, or what are they talking about? And we'll go through it in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But where are you on your growth curve is the first question. If you're looking at your scenario models, growth is rarely linear. Have you recently exploded, but maybe you're starting to feel like you're leveling off? Or do you feel like you have a whole bunch of new products coming out and you're just taking off? These are all very important things to understand when you're negotiating the proper deal structure. Maybe you're stagnant with little hope for recovery. That would mean that your worst case, your base case, and your best case kind of look relatively similar and frankly not too positive. That might lead you to a different deal structure. Or maybe you're undercapitalized and there's significant potential in the business with the right buyers. Sometimes you've reached a plateau, but frankly, maybe you just don't have now the $500,000 or $750,000 that it takes that a buyer could easily afford to build out all the variations and all of the different sizes and all of the different things in your particular niche. Here's the critical point. You don't want to go through these exercises just thinking about the numbers. The critical point in doing scenario analysis is to be able to then describe the underlying story of the business to the buyer. I want to repeat that so that you understand it. A scenario model is not just about the math. It's about you knowing the math well enough that you can create a compelling story that you can communicate to a buyer, such as, if all you can do is put in more capital into this business, I know that I can increase the earnings by 55% based on just my current products being able to be out there with all variations. That's the point of negotiating and using the scenario model lifts, lanes, and levers to their highest effect. Okay, so in this particular example, in the worst case scenario, we're flat over the next 12 months, and then over the next 24 months or 36 months, we're only growing at 10%. So it's kind of low growth, And it's kind of high risk to stay in that environment because the difference between flat and going down isn't that much. In the base case, as you can see, we've just created a scenario where you're growing a little bit faster on your own, meaning that you're a little bit more optimistic, but you're bringing in buyer capital to launch SKUs a little bit more aggressively that are already in your project plan and your pipeline. And so we're overriding an additional 20% growth if you had access to more capital. And then in the best case scenario, we're running a scenario model where it's 40% growth and 30%, as you can see, to 20%. And again, these are just illustrative numbers, but the point is that in the best case scenario, you're modeling out that the capital infusion works and you matched up with a buyer that's great at diversifying to Europe, for example, and you're only in the States. The goal isn't to put together things that are too, quote unquote, pie in the sky or too conservative, but to focus on what's the likely range of outcomes in these scenarios and then look at what the story is that it's saying. The key part too then is to not just put the scenarios together for operating the business, but think about the impact on the valuation of the business itself. Now, as you can see here, in the deal that we were doing before, there's not that much valuation difference between the worst, the base, and the best in what I would call sort of the top level payments, because most of them were guaranteed and not contingent, and there was maybe just $500,000 on a stabilization payment that you hit in all scenarios, but you maybe missed that in the worst case scenario. But here's where it can get interesting. If you're doing things where you're doing any types of different types of rolled equity, now take a look at the impact on a second exit. So as you can see now, the multiple at the bottom ranges from 4.25 to 6.92 to 8.8. Again, this is just an example scenario, but it does illustrate the power of rolled equity to potentially dramatically increase your lifetime effective multiple if you're the right candidate for it. And the key point that I always want to stress is that not all of these types of structures will be in place for your deal, but you need to understand all of them in order to negotiate the right deal. Okay, now we're going to talk about how do your different scenarios relate to structuring the priorities of what you want to negotiate. The first we'll start out is the worst case scenario. I like to think of the worst case scenario as the meal itself. And I want to make sure that the money that you get off the table is that the contingencies are only icing on the cake, but they are not the meal themselves. And that's how we always like to negotiate a premium valuation. So that means that in a worst case scenario, you still receive acceptable amounts of cash. Maybe you had to do some seller financing, and you would always get your balance sheet true up. You add up all of those numbers, and in the worst case scenario where you're 90% likelihood that the business is at least going to do this, you feel comfortable with the transaction. Next up is the base case. This is supposed to be your most accurate case with an 80% likelihood or more. And this brings in the same things from the worst case, but allows you to start reaching that stabilization payment as an additional compensation. And remember that individual or topco rolled equity are almost always going to be in place no matter what you perform. The reason they're not listed in the worst case is typically if you're not showing a very high growth business, it's very hard to negotiate rolled equity in the first place. And then finally, you've got your best case where you're not only maximizing the other parts, but you're bringing in the ability to maximize the earnout as well. So what we're doing, just to repeat, is we're starting now to relate your lifts to all of the 11 different levers of how you get paid. And do you see now that if you have all of these different variables that are out there, you've got a much more powerful negotiating strategy that you can employ with a buyer? Okay, this next slide I like to always talk about. I always like to say, naysayers use cliches, but experts project and risk mitigate. It's very easy to say that an all cash, no earnout deal is better. You can brag and say, well, I got all my money off the table up front. And you never really know if you left money on the table because you never were even negotiating a contingent payment. And this is even more important because as this market of e-commerce has gotten more sophisticated, we've seen some buyers fail and some succeed, and some sellers negotiate earnouts that were hit and other ones negotiate earnouts that weren't hit. This goes back to the meal versus the icing on the cake analogy. However, until you know the total structure of a deal, you have no ability to say that an all cash, no earnout deal is better, because oftentimes it's the lowest multiple that's offered. So, to repeat, nobody is going to know if your earnout deal or your rolled equity deal is bad or good until it's negotiated and you look at your business against the buyer's capabilities and then determine whether or not it was a smart move to make. And oftentimes people think that if you negotiate an earnout, that means that you gave up money up front in order to get the earnout. And the reality is, a lot of times, certainly in the negotiations that we do, that's just not simply the case. The fact of the matter is many buyers have a limit on how much they can put into the non-contingent bucket. And after you've, in essence, filled that water bucket, it makes no sense to not have some money on the contingency if it goes well, because you might as well take a shot on it. It's not going to impact your cash at closing. The key part is that the more money that you have in the contingent bucket, the more you have to do buyer and seller due diligence to make sure that the synergies are there for you likely to hit it. Putting all of these things together, the core tenet for you is to be able to see the various options and then negotiate accordingly to maximize the value with minimal risk to the business. The lanes, levers, and lifts scenario is what guarantees you an eyes wide open exit. And recognize that based on your projected lift, different lanes and different levers are going to become more or less appropriate. Okay, we've reached the end of the 3 parts of the lanes, lifts, and levers. Recognize that maximizing your valuation exists in the ability to try and balance these different things and then negotiate the proper lane and leverage on a prioritized basis for you. Now that you have the full context of your business, you can negotiate an eyes wide open exit. Thank you.